So good morning, everyone. I'm really very grateful. Thank you, all of you, for last week's celebration. It was really great. The music and the worship was outrageous. You really felt, and we have heard from family and friends and our family doctor, how they felt God's spirit in this place, and that is entirely God, and we're just instruments. But it's really nice when God shows up like that, and you can have an experience that is so tangible that people talk about that. I'm always sort of blown away by that experience. Donna and I, on Friday night, we ran into the city. San Gennaro Fest is down in Mulberry Street, and there's just something about 100 or 200 food vendors, down the street that just attracts me. I don't know what it is. It calls to me, so we go, it calls to me. So we go down, and it's a great celebration, and it was crowded. It was really kind of nice to be back in the city and to feel like the city was gaining some life again, and there was some momentum, and there were people there, and some with masks, some without, but generally, there was a stir of just social gatherings, which was nice. As we're coming from, we were coming along, and as we were driving up in a taxi, we noticed, we both noticed on the side, it was a side street. At this point, we were somewhere in the 40s, probably somewhere around 44th, 45th Street. And as we were coming through, in a really dark street with no real fanfare or no crowds, how the side streets are off of Times Square, there's just not a lot of activity. There was an old phone booth. At least it looked like a phone booth, one of the last standing ones in New York City. It's probably on a tour somewhere to come and see this phone booth. And then next to it was a mailbox, and immediately next to it, what you saw was one of those bikes in New York City. If you go, you can pay someone. They bike, and the two of you can sit in the back, and they drive you around the city so you can see everything, and they're biking and pedaling. So there's one of these on the side, and it's empty. There's no one in it. And then right next to it, again, off to the side, totally inconspicuously, there is one of our Muslim brothers who has already rolled out his mat, his rug, his prayer rug, and is starting to pray. And we both commented on the witness of this individual, and he wasn't doing it as a witness. I don't think he cared if anyone was coming or not. He was facing east, and for him, this was going to be his moment of prayer there on a side street in New York City, without any of the fanfare of a temple or a building or great music or a preacher. It was just a moment for him and God. We were driving yesterday, and we were passing some houses down by the water, and they're smaller houses. And as we were stopped at the light, I noticed off to the right, in between two fences, there was a statue of Jesus, a Sacred Heart of Jesus, and it wasn't life-size, but let's say it was a fairly big size in the back of this house. And right there, in probably 2 foot away, was an elderly woman who just was standing there looking at Jesus. And you could just tell that she was having a conversation. You could tell that she was caught up in prayer, around that. Again, in all of its simplicity, and without any fanfare. And she didn't even know, and I felt, how you feel guilty like you've barged in on something and you probably shouldn't have been there. Not that she knew, but I knew, and I felt like a little awkward about that. I felt awkward too about the gentleman who was praying, our Muslim brother. And then finally yesterday we're at a place for breakfast that we always go to, and this woman comes, who's been serving us for the last 16, 17 years, as a waitress. Her son, is having some immunodeficiency syndrome, and his white blood cells are low. And so, there she is, and she knows us. She knows, that I'm a pastor. She's close with Donna, and I'm always the one who's busting her for more coffee and stuff like that, but she ends up talking about, and asking for our prayers. Now, this is the middle of a restaurant. But she makes a point of saying, maybe you could light a bunch of candles and, call upon the saints. And look, I'm the first one to admit that, our brothers and sisters in heaven, are very open to interceding for us. And as there is a church here on earth, there is also the church in heaven, and the two are connected by this person of Jesus. And yes, there can be intercessions and all, but there is no need for the candles and all that. And I said to her, that's why I said to her, there's no need for the candles. I said, all you have to do is simply ask. All you have to do is simply talk. Jesus is already here. I mean, clearly here we are, I'm having my onion and bacon omelet, and Donna's having pancakes, and here's this woman talking to us, and you can't tell me at that moment in time, God's not present. I say all this because, one, I want us to be attentive to, as Christians, as followers, and as people who are looking for God, that sometimes we have to do the looking. Sometimes we have to look for those opportunities and those places and sort of see God in and midst. And look, this is nothing special to us. We didn't set any of this up. We just happen to be in these places and perhaps a little bit more sensitized maybe than most, looking for God. But here in just, a 2-day period, God showed up in 3 different ways, to let us know that God was alive and well, and that God loves us and cares for us, and that we should, as a people, be praying to God. But something, looking for God and praying to God requires humility. Looking for God and praying to God requires humility, and this is a really long way around to get to the gospel for today. But when we talk about who is, and Jesus asked them the question, what were you talking about on the way, and they remain silent. I want you to recognize that in this one gospel passage, these disciples have stayed quiet twice. Once, when Jesus is talking to them about what's going to happen to him, that he already knows that the powers of this world are already setting up and keying against him, and yet he is being honest and faithful to the will of the Father, that no matter what happens, he's never alone, never isolated, and that even his death will result in something grander, which is the resurrection. And Donna and I have had this conversation over the last couple of weeks about resurrection in our own lives. When people thought that they had the best of us, that situation and scenarios thought that they had the best of us, and they thought they have controlled us and contained us, and ultimately there is this resurrection that has brought us to a different level, not because we've chosen that, but that God is with us and God moves us along. And indeed, Jesus' death upon the cross and his resurrection was so that we as Christians realize that even in our physical deaths, that is not the end. There is this resurrection that is promised to each and every one, and that is where our joy comes in. That is where our hope comes in, is that no matter what we see here, ultimately God succeeds. Ultimately God bears at the end. But here we have these disciples who 2 times are afraid to talk to Jesus. So I want us to be sensitive to the fact that, there's not always this great, grand, warm, fuzzy relationship with Jesus that sometimes even myself preach about. How they're always gathered around the table, how they travel together, they've lived together for 3 years. But we have to recognize gospel passages like this out of Mark let us know that sometimes the disciples just don't get it. And because they just don't get it, they sort of, Jesus gets a little flustered and annoyed about that. That as much as he is there, as much as he himself is talking to them, they're not able to catch on. And the fact that they're not able to catch on sort of, miffs him. So, here, he says to them, he knows, right? If you're walking in a group, you don't need to be a mind reader or be gifted by the Spirit to know what a conversation Christian is, right? You hear words, you hear certain. So I'm sure Jesus picked up that the disciples were talking among themselves of who is greatest. And you could see Peter, and always putting his foot in his mouth. You could see Peter coming up with stuff. You could see James and John, right? Who in another gospel passage say that they want to sit at his right and at his left. Everyone's vying for a position. What they're vying for is in a position of a reality that they want. They want ultimate Roman occupation to end. They want Jerusalem reestablished. They want a kingdom, and they want Jesus to be the king. And by the way, when he's the king, I'm going to be the greatest. That's what their vision is. And yet here is Jesus just a couple of moments earlier saying that he is going to die, that he is going to suffer, and that the powers and the political influences of this world are going to overcome him. And when they do recognize that there is ultimately this resurrection, they don't even pay attention to that. They end up arguing among themselves about who is the greatest. So you could understand how Jesus might be a little unnerved by that. But notice that, Jesus is really calling out and challenging them, to be humble. To be humble. To not take the first spot. Not to always want things to go your way. And if anything, the paradox of Jesus is that in weakness and vulnerability is where you encounter God. Just say that again. In weakness and in vulnerability is where we encounter God. And we're uncomfortable with that. We are. We live in a society that it goes by how much power, prestige, money, wealth, what kind of political influence you have, right? I mean, we judge ourselves based on those things. We judge ourselves based on titles, the titles that we have, the titles we bear, because our title generally makes us better than or higher than or considered more important than somebody else. And yet here is Jesus sort of saying, no, it cannot be that way with you. He's talking to us. He's talking to us as contemporary everyday Christians. And I don't know about you, but I squirm when you hear this. Because what Jesus is challenging is so anti-social in its context, anti-establishment in its context. Have you ever thought to yourself, for whatever reason, right? Why would the Romans care about an itinerant preacher from Nazareth? Right? What is possibly the issue with putting this man Jesus to death? What do the Jewish leaders care? I mean, okay, he's got some followers. He's saying some stuff that is radical, but it's no different than some of what the prophets were saying. Doesn't it really come down to the fact that if they wanted to, they could have allowed Jesus to continue his ministry? If they were smart, wouldn't they have tried to work some of that into their messaging? Because they weren't really popular at the time. If they would have used a popular preacher and sort of worked that in, that could have really benefited them in some way, shape, or form, but they didn't. Why? Because in their own minds, they were here and Jesus was there. And by the way, Jesus had no formal training. They called him rabbi, and he wasn't really an official rabbi per se. He's running around doing these works, and they're really teed off, and their own pride blinds them to the truth. So it didn't matter what Jesus was saying or doing or how good that was or how it was helping people or how it was really, really just restating what the prophets had talked about for ages. And yet they then get together with the Romans and they have this man killed. The political powers of that day choose that it is better simply to get rid of him. And I don't know about you, but sometimes in my life, I feel like that as well. There are some people who I had thought had more political power and prestige or whatever and more influence. And so, they make their moves, they do their thing, they say their thing. You end up in a place where you don't want to be. But ultimately, I found that in those moments of weakness comes resurrection, comes this whole new change. And I'm just wondering, if we're not able to be humble with God, if we're not willing to fall to our knees, literally or even just within the depths of our hearts, if we're not willing to take the time away to be with Jesus and to cry out in our need, if we're not looking for those moments to simply be in Jesus' presence and say, hey, look, I don't have all of this together. I have issues, I have worries, I have concerns. There's all this stuff going on in my life. Can you help? If we're not humble enough to do that with God, then are we ever going to do that with one another? And we have to ask ourselves, if we did, if we really truly did try to not take the lead, to allow other people to be first, to be more worried about the other person than ourselves, to humble ourselves and not worry about this false dynamic of being the greatest, what would our world look like? What would it look like? It would be amazing. It would be absolutely amazing, because we would not see each other as competition. We would see each other as family. And I think that is what Jesus is all about. I just want to go back to this last line, because this is the one that really bothers me the most. When he's talking to his disciples, Jesus knows that they've talked about who is the greatest among them. And Jesus calls the 12, the disciples, us, calls them together, and he says, if you want to be the greatest, you must be the least. It must be that way with you, meaning us. If we're truly calling ourselves followers of Jesus, then there has to be a psychological, mental, societal shift in our hearts and our minds. And we have to choose to live by that. We have to choose and infuse that into every decision we make. That even if we're given the titles, we will not accept the role or the authority of that title. We are still can find ways of being humble even in the face of that. But Jesus makes it clear, if we're going to be his followers, if we're going to be his disciples, then it cannot be that way with us. And he's not asking. He's basically telling us to be this way with one another. And ultimately, he gives the greatest example by his suffering and death upon the cross. God bless you.